And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greetings, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Thursday, September 19th, 2024. And as usual, I start this afternoon's presentation with the state of the sea ice. And we find that the late summer melt-off has pretty much reached what we would call the minimum ice extent. Really nothing of note reported along the Arctic coast down through the Chukchi Sea and Bering Strait, with the exception along the Russian Arctic coastline. There is some remnant ice that is staying there, but we are very close, days probably within, at some point, it'll be declared that we have reached minimum sea ice. And looking at the weather map here for late Thursday night into early Friday morning, we have an area of low pressure that's heading northeastward up into the Gulf that will impact the Panhandle Friday into Saturday. We have a weak front pushing along the Arctic coast, more of a trough, and then back to the west, a couple of low pressures along the western Aleutians and toward the Kamchatka coastline. And what will happen is that the low here in the lower central Gulf will continue northeastward with a front, producing small craft and gale force winds. The gale force winds will likely be tonight into portions of Friday along the outer coast and southern parts of the Panhandle. Back to the west, we have a kind of the remnant low there up through the central Aleutians, but by the time we get into Saturday afternoon, the system that's out here along the northeastern Gulf just washes out, and we have a couple of weaker lows push up in through northwest Canada, and then just a weak trough in the north. Areas along the west coast and southwest coast, especially Kuskokwim and Bristol Bay, which has been very stormy over the past couple of weeks. Enjoy the quieter stretch of weather. We're looking at drier, calmer weather over much of the west coast and southwest for Friday and Saturday. Some areas may even see that good weather linger into Sunday. Next low of concern will be coming out of the North Pacific toward the central Aleutians Saturday afternoon. This system will translate east-northeastward and impact the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island later Sunday into early Monday, and then spreading up along areas of the western Gulf. And so that'll be the next notable system that we'll contend with. But in the meantime, the front that is coming into the Panhandle will be windy. It'll produce gusts above gale force there, 35 to 40 knot east-southeast winds. With the exception of there in Lynn Canal, we could see gusts 35 knots out of the north here for Friday, and some periods of moderate to locally heavy rain. Some of the heavier rainfall here, the southern half of the Panhandle, especially as we get down here around Craig, Ketchikan, and Metlakatla. As we go further north, winds easterly 20 to 25 knots outside of Yakutat Bay to Cape Suckling. And we're looking at waves 6-7 feet here up along the northeastern Gulf Coast, upwards of 8-9 foot waves there off of the areas of the southwest Panhandle. And then Saturday winds will be south-southeast to 20 knots, including Stevens Passage, Dixon Entrance, northerly winds to 20 knots, Lynn Canal waves 3-4 feet there, and kind of a mix of winds as we have this weak low just over this region southwest of Yakutat, and then trough and another low coming up toward Haida Gwaii. For Friday across the northwestern Gulf, northeast winds 15 knots within Prince William Sound, waves 2 feet. Outside of Hitchinbrook Entrance, we're looking at easterly winds to 20 knots with 5-foot swells, and then along the length of Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knot northerly winds, waves 3 to 4 feet. For Saturday, winds will be northerly 10 knots within Prince William Sound, Upper Cook Inlet. Look for northerly winds 20 to 15 knots off of Anchor Point down to the entrance, Kennedy Entrance. And then northwest winds offshore flow there on the eastern Kenai coast, 15 knots. For the Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, generally north to northeast winds right around 20 knots, waves 4 or 5 feet on the North Pacific side, and 6 feet from Bristol Bay down out to north of Cold Bay. And for Saturday, winds north-northeast there, Bristol Bay, Shelikof Strait, 15 knots, but becoming southeasterly 15 to near 20 knots there, especially north of Cold Bay, and waves generally a few feet along the North Pacific side and 2 to 3 feet on the Bering side. In the Aleutians, we have that low situated just near the central Aleutians, so Easterly to southeasterly flow picks up 25 to 30 knots Nikolsky through Atka. And as we get past Adak, winds go easterly 30 knots, but then turn back toward the northwest there at Kiska, just to the west there of Kiska. And for Saturday, winds will be south-southeast 20 to 25 knots across the eastern central Aleutians, and then kind of turning back more to the north-northwest, Kiska up toward Shemya at 25 to 30 knots. Along the west coast, definitely lighter winds than what we've dealt with. Still some brisk 25-knot offshore flow out of Bristol Bay at 25 knots there Friday. But along Norton Sound, that wider expanse, and along the lower Yukon coast, 10 to 15-knot winds, 2-3-foot waves. Easterly winds, though, to 20 knots there, the Pribilovs, with 4 to 5-foot waves. And come Saturday, look for a drier, certainly a drier pattern Friday into Saturday across the west and southwest coast. Northeast winds 15 knots out of Norton Sound, down along kind of parallel to the lower Yukon Delta at 15 knots, waves 3 feet. Easterly winds 15 to 20 knots there within Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays, as high as 25 knots there at the Pribilovs. And then as we go up through the Bering Strait, winds northerly through the Bering Strait about 15 knots, as well as the lower Chukchi Sea. As we come up along the Arctic coastline, we're looking at winds to have generally a westerly component, 10 to 15 knots from Wainwright to Prudhoe Bay, but switching easterly at Kaktovik, because we do have a weak trough kind of out through this region. And for Saturday, winds will be generally north along the Arctic coast, Kaktovik to Utqiagvik at 10 knots. Those winds continue northeast to north down through the lower Chukchi Sea at 10 knots. And then once we pass through the Bering Strait along the west side of the Seward Peninsula, including Wales and Port Clarence, as well as to the north side of St. Lawrence Island, we're looking at north to northeast winds at 15 knots, with waves generally running right around 3 feet for Saturday.